That night, Jake threw his hat on a chair, wiped his face with a towel, then crouched beside his bed to slide out an old coffee can from underneath, his hope chest for building his own house. He took it up and spilled it abruptly onto his dresser top. Pushing the coins and paper dollars around and counting under his breath, he glanced up to a calendar advertising McFinney's hardware store for May. Most of the days were crossed out. His eyes hopelessly roamed the room. "Oh, that's just great. In about 100 years I'll be able to buy one shoe." He fell back onto his worn patchwork bedspread and stared at the ceiling. "I might as well just be working for free." He sighed heavily and whispered to himself, "I've got to find another job." Summer, 1932. The Kanto Gakuin School, Yokohama. On a balmy summer evening, Jimmy joined a group of 77 students in a cramped second-floor classroom, adorned with sweeping handmade banners in Japanese reading Christian Student Movement, International Goodwill Meeting. Other posters declared, "Peace, our greatest gift for the future," and support eternal peace. There were a few staff in attendance, and handheld fans fluttered throughout the audience like butterfly wings. The student leader spoke passionately. "We can create goodwill to mankind. Many of us want disarmament, but those who profit from selling the death machines of war oppose it." A small applause rose as the young man cleared his throat. "We can resist the great enemy of war itself by first disarming our minds and hearts of the hatred that leads to fighting in the first place." Jimmy was a regular at these meetings, and his heart filled with pride at the courage of these young men to openly oppose the military ambitions of the nation. The Japanese way was to conform, but these young men, the leaders of tomorrow, were declaring themselves their own persons. He loved it. A student beside Jimmy leaned to him and whispered, "Who are they?" tilting his head toward the back of the room. Jimmy nonchalantly turned and briefly glanced to the back. Fear gripped him at the sight of 4 officers in blue uniforms whispering among themselves. He discreetly leaned to the student. "The thought police," he whispered. "The Toko. Just keep looking forward." He'd never seen the Toko here before. This was not a good development. The speaker saw the officers but continued anyway, his eyes darting across the audience. Jimmy knew that the Japanese had military police officers, called the Kempei Tai, but they also had men who were the special hire police, or thought police, the Tokubetsu Koto Keisatsu, or just the Toko. Formed in 1911 in response to an anarchist group's plot in 1910 to kill Emperor Meiji, Hirohito's grandfather, they investigated political groups or anyone who were deemed a threat to the essence of Japan, but in recent years their power expanded rapidly, questioning, detaining, and arresting thousands for subversive ideologies, anything that opposed the officially approved philosophy of the government. The leader of the Toko had finally had enough. He strode to the front of the room, leading the other 3 officers, waving his hands over his head and interrupting the speaker mid-sentence. "This meeting is adjourned." The speaker stopped as gasps trickled through the crowd. "This is an illegal meeting. All of you know that anyone who organizes a group for the purpose of challenging the national essence of Japan will be sentenced to imprisonment. Everyone go back home. Go." The other officers took hold of the speaker and his 2 friends beside him at the podium, yanked their arms behind their backs, and clasped them in handcuffs. By then, everyone was standing and muttering in hushed fear and shock. Jimmy called out in Japanese, "What have they done wrong? They only want to help make the world a safer place. You should arrest me instead of them." As the Toko escorted the student leaders to the back of the room, the Toko leader looked Jimmy up and down. "You're just a stupid gaijin." Another Toko pushed Jimmy aside as they made their way for the exit. "They only want peace. What's wrong with that?" The cuffed student leader stumbled forward with his head bowed. He glanced over at Jimmy, who felt the fear of this young man facing an uncertain future. Some weeks later, briefcase in hand, Jimmy walked across the campus and glanced at his watch, then turned to the sound of plainclothes students marching in step to the commands of an army officer. Jimmy's face darkened. He made an about face and stormed off. This was the last straw. Inside Dr. Sakata's office, Jimmy stood before his desk with his hands stretched wide. "What in the world is going on? I thought we'd all agreed not to accept military training here." Dr. Sakata looked up, restraining his emotions. "You know I don't like this any more than you do, but you need to understand that if we didn't accept training for the students now, their compulsory service in the army would be even longer. It's only because of my own military service that they allowed us to be the last Christian school in all Japan to accept this training. It doesn't mean we accept the idea of war." "No? Then what does it mean?" "What? If the government sees us as a threat, they'll shut us down, and how will that serve our students?" Jimmy walked away from the desk and turned around. Dr. Sakata pulled open a desk drawer and dropped an envelope on the front of his desk, facing Jimmy. "This is your stamp?" Sakata asked with a touch of annoyance. "You're stamping your letters with this?" he said, tapping the envelope with his finger. Jimmy stepped closer and peered down through his round-rimmed glasses at a cancelled envelope, rubber-stamped with bright red letters reading, "Friendships, not battleships." Jimmy's face lightened as he had this stamp custom made for himself. He peered up and cocked his head. "Friendships are better than battleships," he said with a grin. "Don't you agree?" Sakata looked away and back with frustration. "Have you used this before?" "Many times." Dr. Sakata exhaled angrily. "We have to be careful not to arouse suspicion. You need to stop stamping your mail like this." Their eyes locked. "I will." Jimmy paused. "When there are no more battleships?" He cared deeply for Dr. Sakata and knew what a quandary he was in, but saw no easy path ahead for either of them. The president wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, stood up, and walked over to the window. Jimmy joined him, observing the students marching in unison. "Have you registered?" Jimmy looked at Dr. Sakata. "Registered?" The school president continued gazing at the students through the window. "All foreigners must register with the Toko. I'm sorry, but we have to comply." Chapter 9, 1935. The California-Nevada border, 25 miles northwest of Alturas, California. Jake sat hunched over in the saddle and sighed. They were at a standstill. Again. He pushed his hat high up on his forehead and twisted to look back at the string of 6 mules hitched together behind him on the mountain road, saddled with all manner of crates, barrels, and canvas bags. The air was rich with the scent of pine trees which covered the low mountains. After 2 years at $1 a day as a ranch hand, he jumped at the chance for this $5 a day job as a sheep tender delivering supplies to the herdsmen. He called it the biggest hotel in the world, sleeping under an open sky. "Hey, in the back! Yeah, you!" Jake glared at the last mule in the train, who cocked his ears forward. "We're a team here. You know mule team? We all work TOGETHER. You, me, and—" The mule turned his lip up and pitched his head away. "Hey, don't you look away when I'm talking to you. Maybe you do that at home, but not with me, you don't. Now pick it up back there. Got it?" The mule turned back and shook the dust off his head and neck as if to be saying no. "Well, at least I'm not working with jackasses." Jake turned back around with a smirk and pulled the brim of his hat down. With a click of his tongue and a kick to his mule, the train lurched forward again, up the gradual mountain path. With few expenses, he was finally enjoying himself and saving up money. 1936, Tokyo. Fuchida cupped a crumpled ball of paper in both hands as he knelt on the floor across from his son, Yoshiya, now 3 years old, who held a thin plank in a fierce baseball stance. "And the pitch!" He tossed the ball underhand, and Yoshiya whacked it across the room. "Home run! I did it! I win!" Yoshia ran wildly around his father, who stood up, grabbed his son, and swung him up onto his shoulders. Haruko, his wife, beamed. "It's so nice to have you home. Your trips at sea seem to last so long." Fuchida plucked a cluster of grapes from a bowl on the table and popped a few into his mouth, then handed the cluster up to his son around his neck. "Well, I'll be home for a while now. I still can't believe they selected me." The Naval Staff College in Tokyo was the next step into the upper echelons of the Imperial Japanese Navy, but of the hundreds of applicants, only 24 were selected. He had worked hard to achieve entrance to the program and was excited by the opportunity to hone his knowledge and skills, not to mention the opportunity to gain a little prestige as well. "I think you wouldn't have believed it if they didn't select you. And now my husband is even a lieutenant commander. Now all you need is a daughter." Smiling, Haruko looked down at her bulging belly and circled it with her hands. Reaching up to his son, Fuchida pulled a small branch of grapes off the cluster and held them to Haruko's mouth. "Then feed the baby." The Naval Staff College, Tokyo. The class instructor slowly strode back and forth at the front as he continued before the group of officers. "We are rapidly amassing heavy cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. As I speak, plans are underway to construct the largest, most powerful battleships the world has ever seen, twice the size of the biggest American battleships. With such power, we will be able to negotiate from a position of strength without having to fire a single shot." Sitting at attention among fellow officers, Fuchida did his best to follow along, but kept drifting off, thinking what he would say in counter-arguments. He knew that the premise of Kantai Kessen, or the decisive victory doctrine, was based on the Japanese Navy's resounding success in defeating the Russian Navy in the Battle of Tsushima, but so much had changed since then. The concept was to lure an opponent into the home waters of Japan, all the while picking off ships with submarines, then ambushing the worn fleet in a single, decisive battle, ending any war in one fell swoop of the sword. But Fuchida felt the naval command was preparing for the battles of the past, not the war of the future. "If forced into war, we'll do the same with the United States as we did with the Russians." The instructor leaned onto his desk and looked over the room with authority. "We soundly defeated their navy by drawing them into one decisive battle. Our superior battleships and tactics will quickly crush them. They'll never bother us again." Fuchida downed a shot of sake in the smoke-filled officers' dining area that evening. "Ridiculous!" Sitting with Gender and friends, he continued. "What, are we going to hand the enemy our script and tell them to follow it? What if they don't do exactly what we expect?" Gender ate the last noodles and soup from his bowl held to his mouth, then slammed it down. "Even if everything went to plan, both navies would lose a lot of ships, and the US has a much greater capacity to replace their ships than we do. To control the outcome, we must dominate the sky and focus on building more planes and aircraft carriers." "Instead of battleships," Gender chimed in. "Better used as piers or scrap iron." The fellow officers chuckled nervously. Gender shook a cigarette out of his pack and lit it. "They live in the past, in the glory days of the big gunships ruling the seas." The other officers at the table listened intently. Fuchida leaned forward and spoke more quietly. "Deputy Navy Minister Yamamoto agrees that we should prepare more aircraft carriers." "Yes, but Vice Admiral Nagumo disagrees." One of the other officers wedged his way into the conversation. "Why don't you teach on this, Gender? It's a valid point." Gender exhaled a cloud of smoke and smirked. "The admirals won't allow flyers to teach at their naval college. They don't understand. The world's changed, but they haven't." Spring, 1937. The Kanto Gakuin School, Yokohama. In a recreation shed among volleyball nets, baseball bats, and shelves of musty tarps and balls, Jimmy sat at a workbench, rubbing oil on an old baseball mitt like a doctor with a wounded patient. A 14-year-old student stood beside him, looking impatiently outside through a window to the rest of the students throwing baseballs and shouting to each other. "So," Jimmy said in his best Japanese, "you think the students can take the staff at baseball, eh?" The boy shrugged. "We're not going to play easy, you know." Jimmy always made a point to try to connect in some personal way with his students, and wasn't one to give up easily. The steady sound of bats cracking balls echoed outside. The student observed Jimmy's meticulous oiling of the glove. "Mr. Covell, excuse me for asking, but why do the Western nations dislike the Japanese people?" Jimmy pushed his glasses back up, poured more oil on his rag, and continued without looking up, not revealing his joy in the boy opening up. "This is a good question." It was a question that troubled him deeply, and one he'd long contemplated, written about, and spent a great deal of time working toward answering. Why do the Japanese dislike the Koreans and the Chinese, and even the Burakumin, the Ainu people, and the Ryukyuans, all people of Japan? He quickly glanced up over his glasses. Jimmy's sensitivity to others led him to research these people within Japanese society, the Burakumin, Ainu, and Ryukyuans, who had endured centuries of outcast status due to occupation, the region they came from, or even their looks. People who were loyal citizens of Japan but with Korean or Chinese ancestry were equally shunned. He routinely suppressed his anger at the Japanese for loudly complaining about how the world treated them while they mistreated others in their own nation just as badly, or worse. He looked up at the student, who looked back intently. "It's easy to see the faults in others, but not so easy to see our own," he said. "Isn't it?" The student nodded. Jimmy pulled the glove on and smacked his fist into the pocket. "We're all a little proud. We think we're better than others. But if everyone thinks they're better than everyone else, then doesn't that make us all the same?" He grinned, realizing his impromptu logic. Pulling off the glove and handing it to the boy, Jimmy spoke with a glint in his eye. "We all have the same father. We're made in his image. We're all brothers." Standing up, Jimmy flipped a baseball to the student, who wasn't quite prepared to catch it. "Now," Jimmy said, "let's see who has the most team spirit, eh?" Seeing the boy's bashful grin, he patted him on the shoulder, pulled on a baseball cap, grabbed a few bats, and escorted him into the sun onto the grassy field. Charma couldn't help herself from glancing over to Jimmy at the kitchen table as she dried plates and stacked them in the cupboard. He was huffing, sighing, and fidgeting as he flipped pages of a new book. Every now and then, the children playing in the next room let out a squeal or a thump on the floor. "New textbook?" Charma asked. Jimmy didn't look up. More like wholesale propaganda, but then, what would you expect from the Ministry of Education, Bureau of Thought Control? Jimmy removed his glasses and with the other hand reached across his forehead to massage his aching temples. How they got him to do their dirty work was beyond him and pushing him to his limits. When he looked up, he noticed that the overcast afternoon sky was quickly darkening. Restoring his round-rimmed glasses, he looked over at Charma and spoke in full teacher mode. In 1870, all the Shinto shrines in Japan were nationalized and came under state control. The office of emperor was elevated to a position of, well, to more than just the national leader, the spiritual leader as well. In the last decade or so, all the outlets of communication have come under complete government control as well. You know, radio, newspapers, magazines, and, of course, education. So this, Jimmy held up the book, is the new required reading for the schools. Charma picked up another wet plate from the rack. For which grades? All college and upper-level students in the entire nation have to study it. Teachers, too. Every day, Kokutai no Hongi, the principles of the national essence of Japan. He set the open book down on the table with a slight plop. It's taken me a while to get the translation straight. It's kind of difficult in places, so bear with me. Jimmy twisted his head and shrugged his shoulders like a fighter getting ready to enter the ring. Listen to this, quote, "The unbroken line of emperors, receiving the oracle of the founder of the nation, reigns over the Japanese empire eternally." He flipped forward a few pages and slid his finger down to his penciled notes. Quote, "His Majesty set forth the great policy of returning to the spirit of ancient times, which had as its nucleus the emperor, who is a humanly manifested deity in keeping with the great significance of the God-handed founding of the empire." Keep in mind, this is a school textbook, of all things. As he ruffled the pages to find another spot, Peggy, 15, crept up behind him, putting her arms around his shoulders, hugging him with her face pressed against his, while clutching a bright yellow-bordered National Geographic in one hand. "What are you reading, Daddy?" Jimmy sat back and grasped her arm, his face lightening. "I've been promoted to a position in the Ministry of Propaganda. Isn't that great?" Peggy wrinkled her brow. "Dad, you're being sarcastic again. Mum said you should just speak your mind or say nothing at all." Charmer grinned. "Okay, the government is trying to force teachers to spread their idea of the divinity of the emperor in order to tighten their grip on enforcing their military ambitions. Is that better?" "What do you mean?" "They, the government that is, want total control of the people, so they're essentially conscripting the teachers to tighten that control. It's the last thing I'd ever want to do." Peggy smiled and nodded. "Sorry, Dad, you'll figure it out. You always do." She gave a quick kiss on his cheek, stood up, and opened the magazine she'd been holding. "The 1936 Olympics were marvellous last year. Look at these pictures from Berlin." She spread the magazine flat over his book and began flipping pages and pointing out photos. "The excitement of the crowds. Look at this stadium, the parades." Like every normal parent, Jimmy knew exactly what was coming next. "So, in 3 years the Olympics will be in Tokyo. Can we go?" Looking at Charmer, Jimmy could only think of how tight their money was, yet he loved to please his children. "I think there might be a possibility of that." "Oh, Daddy!" Peggy gave another hug to Jimmy, then jumped back to the colour photos in the National Geographic. "Look at the pageantry on the boulevards, Daddy. It'll be just like that here." She opened to a spread of strikingly colourful photographs of throngs of smiling people on streets decorated with national flags and dozens of huge red banners, emblazoned with swastikas. A tingle of fear shot through his body. He'd read enough of Germany's repeated disregard of treaties by rearming and their massive build-up of weapons to know it could only lead to one place. He leaned back in his chair, gently closed the magazine, and handed it to Peggy with a disarming smile and a pat on her hand. "Let's talk about this more a little later, all right?" Peggy looked at him with her innocent eyes, oblivious to the omens of death she had just seen. "Okay, Dad. Thanks." She picked an apple from a bowl of fruit on the table and trotted off with her magazine. After a few seconds to recompose himself, Jimmy sighed deeply and cleared his throat. He really wanted Charmer to hear this. "All right," he continued. "Let me get to the heart of the matter. Quote, loyalty means to revere the emperor and to follow him implicitly. The land of Japan stands high above the other nations of the world, and her people excel all the peoples of the world." Jimmy looked over to Charmer and raised his eyebrows. Though holding a damp handful of utensils, she'd stopped drying and looked disturbed and frightened. Thunder shook the windows. "Our imperial forces have a duty to make our national prestige greatly felt within and without our country, to preserve the peace of the Orient in the face of the world powers, and to preserve and enhance the happiness of mankind. It is when this harmonious spirit of our nation is spread abroad throughout the world to every race that true world peace and its progress and prosperity are realized." Jimmy rolled his eyes and sat back, lifting the book off the table. The annexation of Korea and the efforts exerted in the founding of Manchukuo are one and all but expressions of the great august will promoting the peace of the country and the advancement of the great task of love for the people, thus radiating the grace of the imperial throne. Jimmy muttered under his breath, "Yeah, try telling that to the Koreans." Shaking his head, he flipped past a few more pages. Okay, here it is. The warrior spirits work inseparably with the spirits of peace. It is in subduing those who refuse to conform to the magnificent influence of the Emperor's virtues that the mission of our imperial military forces lies. Jimmy threw the book in the air and let it land on the table with a thump. Charmer winced. The Emperor is divine. The people owe total loyalty to him alone, and the destiny of Japan is to expand and conquer, Jimmy said, then waited for some reaction from Charmer. They're using the schools to build a world-class military machine. Jimmy jumped up from his chair and angrily swung around behind it. I'm perfectly fine with people giving this kind of loyalty and obedience to God in the name of peace, but to a man in the name of war. No one should render unto Caesar what belongs to God alone. The room was invaded by David, now 12, and his Japanese companion, both in white headbands, furiously clacking wooden samurai swords. David twisted, quickly raising his sword, and chopped down at his friend, who parried the swing with his own sword and an accompanying grunt. As David lifted his sword for a new swing, Jimmy quickly reached out and grabbed the wooden blade mid-air. He looked into his son's smiling face, then over to Charmer with dead seriousness. Glancing back at David, he gently eased the sword down, then from his son's hand. "Son, we don't do that in this family. Swords are for killing." Jimmy slid the hachimaki off David's head and smiled, trying not to cause him to be afraid. "If you want to fight, why don't you boys go play some shogi, all right?" The boys darted back out of the room as fast as they'd come in. Thunder cracked outside as a hard rain began to fall. Jimmy stared out into the backyard and spoke as if to himself. "I told the president I wouldn't be attending their ceremony tomorrow." Putting the last cup away and closing the cupboard cabinet, Charmer turned around. "What ceremony?" Standing in a light drizzle, the entire student body of Kanto Gakuin lined both sides of the paved street from the school gate leading up to the main castle-like building, all at attention, evenly spaced, perfectly silent, the only sound being of rain dripping between the leaves and an occasional cough. Eventually, a perfectly polished black sedan arrived at the gate and slowly made its way to the front building, an ivy-covered tower, and came to a slow halt with a dull squeal of the brakes. An administrator at the curb, dressed in his finest black suit and tie, shouted out at the top of his voice, "Saikei-rei," literally, profound bow, the deepest bow generally reserved for the emperor alone. Another administrator in suit and tie opened the car door as all of the students bowed deeply and held their positions. Dr. Sakata stepped out of the car holding a large, white rectangular box in his white gloves, and regally made his way up the steps into the school's main hall, followed by a small cadre of administrators in methodical procession. Inside the most honoured place at the school, Dr. Sakata meticulously unfolded the purple velvet inside the box, and one at a time withdrew the imperial portraits of the emperor and empress, and ceremoniously set them inside a shrine-like wooden box adorned with purple curtains. The top of the small shrine displayed a golden chrysanthemum, crest of the imperial family. Stepping back while facing the shrine, he and the entourage bowed reverently in unison and held their posture. Spring, 1937, Medford, Oregon. An unending chorus of chirps from turkey chicks emanated from inside cardboard boxes stacked in a column inside the busy hardware and feed store. While a bearded man in a clerk's apron peered into an open box counting, Jake spoke excitedly on an old wall phone with a mouthpiece that extended out like a black daffodil. "Ma, you sitting down?" I said, "Are you sitting down? You're not going to believe this. I saved up $1,000. Yeah. 2 years of work. $1,000. As the clerk folded up the top of the box and flipped his journal closed, he looked over to Jake. "Keep 'em warm now. Cover 'em up good." Jake looked back, distracted by his call, and waved. "Yeah, I know. Put 'em in the truck. Ma, I bought 500 turkey chicks and I'm going to get 'em fat for the holidays and double my money. What do you think of that?" 6 months later. Standing in a snow-frosted duster and cowboy hat at the same phone, Jake dejectedly waited for the call to go through. Behind him, men wrestled with full-grown turkeys flapping and squawking in a cloud of feathers and stuffed them into cages. "You're not going to believe this, Ma. Too many turkeys this year, no market. I lost it all. Yeah, nearly every penny. Okay, I'll write later." Jake slammed the earpiece down and glared at his lost venture. He whispered stoically, "I should have just fed my money to the turkeys. $1,000. Early December 1937, Hankow, China. As his engine blared in the wind, Fuchida saw that the sunlight had highlighted a streak on the half windshield at the front of his open cockpit. He rubbed it off with the back of his left jacket sleeve, his right hand steady on the stick. Fuchida patted the side wall of his Yokosuka B-4Y biplane like a familiar dog as he led a squadron of 12 planes above China at 15,000 feet, the wind rushing past his smiling face. The aircraft carried 3 men with the navigator and radio operator gunner behind Fuchida. Although his division of Imperial Navy bombers were primarily carrier-based, this time he was working in conjunction with the Japanese army in China. Like the rest of his nation, he beamed with pride over the headlines that read, "Japanese troops on Shanghai front capture Lotian," and thrilled to see their military theories becoming realities. But Fuchida's call away from the Naval Staff College to China stemmed from a bad turn of events. Japan's war with China began in earnest earlier that year at the Marco Polo Bridge, where fighting broke out into full battle. In Nanking, Navy pilots created a diplomatic crisis when they bombed an American gunboat in the Yangtze River, sinking it and killing 3 sailors along with scores of Chinese who were in junks travelling with the Western riverboats. The pilots had received orders from their own headquarters via an army request to attack all shipping in the Yangtze at Nanking. It was referred to as the Panay Incident, after the name of the American ship, USS Panay, and called an incident because Japan in no way wanted to be seen as being at war with China, which could have spurred US and British intervention. Japanese diplomats apologized profusely to the Americans, and Fuchida was called in with others to put a clamp on poorly targeted bombing raids in the area 600 miles due west of Shanghai. Locating the arms manufacturing area near the Yangtze River off to his left, Fuchida raised his hand in the air, tipped his wings, and led his group into their bombing run. They veered left, vectored in on their targets, and released their payloads. On the ground, the Chinese anti-aircraft guns began firing away, but had swung into action too late. The bombs were already falling, and Fuchida's group was peeling away, waiting and watching to see if they hit their marks. Fuchida grinned with satisfaction as buildings erupted into a series of horrendous explosions that cracked through the air, blowing debris into the sky. He had little doubt that China would soon fold under the weight of the Japanese war machine. After several months in China, Fuchida returned to Japan, stopping briefly to see his mother in the Nara prefecture, as his father had died the previous year. Yazo, his father, had also aspired to join the military, but his hopes were crushed by a baseball accident that robbed him of the sight in one eye. Still, he had been a respected teacher in the community, and Fuchida had loved hunting and fishing with his father. He was unprepared as to how much he missed his presence and advice. As he gazed from their porch to Mount Wakakusa in the east, he wondered, "What am I living for? What am I willing to die for?" He was long overdue for a visit to another place. He smiled and nodded his head. "Perhaps," he wondered and sighed, "perhaps I will renew myself there." On his train ride back to the Naval Staff College in Tokyo to complete his studies, he took a slight detour to Icy City, the location of over 120 Shinto shrines. In the Shinto faith, all objects, animate or not, or features of nature, are respected for their kami, or spirits, some more than others. Once at the main complex, he headed straight to Ise-jingu, or the Ise Grand Shrine, home to the shrine of Amaterasu Omikami, the goddess of the sun, the most sacred place in Japan. In his khaki uniform, Fuchida stood pensively below the traditional entrance to all Shinto shrines, the torii, a pair of huge wooden beams spanning between the tops of two cypress columns, the upper beam always being longer. He looked across the arched Uji Bridge over the Isuzu River. It was a demarcation separating the sacred from the worldly. Just what I need, he thought. Fuchida looked up, closed his eyes, heard the unique hohokekyo chirp of the Japanese bush warbler, and breathed in the spring air of the towering cypress trees. He wanted to cleanse his mind from the impurity of war. The still of the forest and solitude of the sacred grounds revitalized his sense of gratitude and a feeling of favor. Opening his eyes, he recalled that the bridge faced east, that on the day of the winter solstice, 2 weeks away, the sun would rise, shining straight down the bridge under the torii, fitting for a temple to the sun god. The shrine had few worshippers that day and afforded him a measure of privacy he relished as he crossed the wooden bridge, the planks giving an occasional creak. Certainly, Fuchida thought, there is nothing to compare with the sun itself. It brings light and causes all things to grow. Without it, there would be no life on earth. He came to the Temisusha, an open-sided, roofed structure over a stone-walled pool of water, and reached for one of the many long-handled bamboo ladles from the wooden grid that overlaid the basin. Fuchida felt privileged. In the distant past, no one but the imperial family was allowed to worship there, but beginning in the 12th century, the samurai warriors were given access, for the sun goddess was the god of victory. In time, others were granted access. He sensed a deep union with the samurai of old as he lifted the dipper and slowly cascaded the cool water over his left hand, then switched hands and poured water over his right. He wondered what the old woman next to him thought she needed purification from. Though not particularly devout, his father taught him Buddhist verses as a boy, which he brushed out onto rice paper and memorized. He'd also spent time in Shinto shrines. Today his mind seemed to drift off into a blend of thoughts and memories. A pure, cloudless heart is a heart which finds life in the true way by dying to one's self and one's own ends. Following the path further through the lush forest, he began climbing the steep stone steps leading to another wooden torii in front of a fenced sanctuary called Kotai Jingu, founded 2,000 years ago and home to the sacred mirror believed to be the very one used to bring Amaterasu Omikami from her cave to deliver sunlight to the entire world. At the top of the steps, his heart pumping from the hike, Fuchida was awed to think that this kami was connected directly to the Emperor of Japan, a spiritual descendant of the kami themselves. Closing his eyes once again, he reverently bowed twice, clapped his hands twice, bowed again, and stood in silence. Opening his eyes and standing upright, he stepped back and bowed again. He wondered if he really believed it, but there was nothing like the awesome power of the sun itself. Certainly the favour of the sun shone down onto his home of Japan, blessing their nation above all others. December 1938, Yokohama. From Ezekiel, Chapter 8. Jimmy spoke quietly in Japanese to the students and friends who had gathered in his tatami-matted living room that evening. With their backs to the sanctuary of the Lord, they were facing east, bowing low to the ground, worshipping the sun. A few lamps cast a golden hue over the dim room as Jimmy looked up over the top of his glasses and scanned their earnest faces. He wondered how much of what he saw they, too, perceived. Peggy sat beside her father, almost leaning against him as he continued. He said to me, Have you seen this, son of man? Is it nothing? To do the detestable things they are doing here, leading the whole nation into violence, thumbing their noses at me, and rousing my fury against them. Therefore I will deal with them in fury. I will neither pity nor spare them. And though they cry for mercy, I will not listen. He gently laid the Bible down, removed his glasses for a moment, and wiped his eyes with his shirt sleeve. A Japanese girl cocked her head and looked at Jimmy quizzically, as if to try to understand his reason for showing such emotion. Jimmy knew that few of them could fathom the depths of horror he feared might lie ahead if the nation didn't change its course. Fury without pity resonated in his mind. This was one of the highlights of his time, being with students and friends crowded together with his wife and children inside their home, all sitting cross-legged or kneeling on the floor, some with open Bibles before them. Here he was free to speak his heart and mind, and so he did. Deeds were almost as important as beliefs to him, but beliefs always preceded deeds. With a refreshing smile and deep inhale, he turned and pointed to a framed poem on the wall, written in both Japanese and English. I love this poem. This is my heart. This is my prayer. Reciting from memory in Japanese, he looked into each face around the room, one at a time. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. He closed his eyes for a second while he spoke. O Divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love others. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. He ended looking at Peggy, whose eyes glimmered with admiration. The room fell silent as most looked downward in contemplation. Jimmy waited. One of the students, a young man, looked up at Jimmy. Mr. Covell, these are difficult things to do. No, not difficult, Jimmy responded. Impossible to do, on our own. But with Almighty God, all things are possible. The student gently nodded, then both of them connected in a soft smile. On the crowded sidewalk along a street in downtown Yokohama, Jimmy held Peggy's arm through his, and in the other hand carried a basket of heads of hakusai, Japanese cabbage. He listened to Peggy's story unfold as a packed streetcar rumbled past. So I asked if I could try out for that part of the play, and since they needed 2 more girls, they said, "Sure, we'd love to have you." Isn't that great, Dad? They stopped walking as Peggy looked at her father's face. He stared at a row of colourful posters going up on a wooden wall over older, peeling bills. The new sheets were all identical, featuring an illustration of proud soldiers surrounded by cheering throngs of civilians, emblazoned with the words, "Asia is for Asians. Working together we bring prosperity to the world." The cold chill he felt wasn't from the weather. Only a week earlier, with great curiosity, he'd watched several toko in a drugstore meticulously go through stacks of magazines, tearing out a single page from each one. He could feel the momentum. A workman pushed his brush to flatten out the wrinkles of the last poster, then plopped it back into a tray of paste at the feet of Jimmy and Peggy. Squinting through the smoke of the cigarette in his teeth, the unshaven worker slowly raised his eyes, stopping at Peggy's fearful face. He smiled with missing teeth, shook his head, and slapped the brush back against the advertisement, pasting it to the wood. Peggy pressed against Jimmy's side, reassured by her father's firm arm around her. Jimmy navigated past the workman and posters. "It's all right, Peggy," he whispered. "Not everyone here believes that." Once again, Jimmy stood before the desk of Dr. Sakata, the school president, who sat with his head down and sighed nervously. Dr. Sakata looked up. "I deeply regret that the school board has asked me to request your resignation by the end of this school year." "Because I oppose Japan's march to war?" Jimmy wasn't really offended. He knew it was coming sooner or later. He just wanted to hear the official reasons, if any. Dr. Sakata stood up, his troubled posture intimating sympathy. Many foreigners have been refused re-entry to Japan, many have been deported, and some have even been arrested. You know this. He walked to the window and gazed at the empty yard. Last week the Toko confronted me and demanded I answer their question. He turned to Jimmy. They shouted, "Who is greater, the Emperor or Jesus?" "What did you say?" I told them they couldn't be compared. Smiling, he continued. Then I asked them, which is better, white or silence? Jimmy's face lit up. He actually pitied Dr. Sakata, who stood over the ever-widening gap between what the nation demanded of him and what his conscience begged of him. Dr. Sakata moved closer to Jimmy. I've intervened to protect you, but I'm afraid I can't do so much longer. Your life's in danger. Walking over to a map on the wall, he put his hands behind his back. Perhaps we can get you a transfer to a school in Tokyo. No, it's just a matter of time before they deport me. I've talked to the mission board and I'd like to go to the Philippines to teach there. The Americans have a strong military presence, so we'll be safe. It's not too far away, so when all this talk of war is over, I'll come back. Dr. Sakata looked back over his shoulder and nodded. The students love you. We look forward to having you here again in the future. They shook hands and held for a moment. Thanks for letting me serve here, Jimmy said. It's been the greatest experience of my life, truly. June 8, 1939, Yokohama Bay. Under a fading light rain, Jimmy set down his suitcases. There she is, he said, as he and his family admired the 570-foot passenger liner Empress of Russia, towering above the waterfront of Yokohama, all three funnels pouring smoke into the blue-grey sky. The docks were a sea of people, umbrellas and suitcases, most moving toward several gangplanks flowing onto the ship. Jimmy had dreaded this moment and looked forward to it, the end of a wonderful time, the beginning of a new adventure. Charmer hugged a Japanese woman who wiped the tears from her face as Peggy, likewise, embraced a Japanese girl her age. The family was surrounded by 70 or so well-wishers, all pressing in to say their last goodbyes in the rain. After shaking hands with a Buddhist monk dressed in traditional grey, a dear friend, Jimmy raised his hands for their attention and spoke in Japanese as the rain dripped from his fedora. Our life here in Japan, our home for nearly 20 years, has overflowed with friendship, love, and wonderful memories. We're so grateful for all of our many, many friends. Charmer blotted her eyes with a handkerchief. This is only a short trip. We'll be coming back again, soon, I hope. Though we may be far away, our hearts will always be close to yours. Goodbye, my friends. In perfect cue, the ship's steam whistle sounded with a fierce shout, blowing a white cloud into the air. Jimmy, Charmer, Peggy, David and Alice gathered their belongings and shuffled toward the gangplank amid shouts from friends. Kovel Sensei Banzai! Kovel Sensei Banzai! November 1939. The open sea off of the coast of Tokyo. The aircraft carrier Akagi carved through the ocean under a brisk, overcast sky. From the air above, Fuchida, now with a narrow moustache, looked down on the ship from his three-man Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber as they banked for their approach. Yamamoto's got no guts, Fuchida reflected. He was displeased with the new commander-in-chief of the combined fleet installed 2.5 months earlier. He knew how much time Yamamoto had spent in the UK and in the US, 2 years at Harvard, and how friendly and comfortable he'd become with the West. Why did he oppose Japan's plans to move into a deeper partnership with Germany? He didn't seem like the bold commander Japan needs to take charge. Fuchida's experience and skill had brought him to the position of squadron commander on the biggest carrier in the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Akagi. Her 8.55-foot runway looked precariously small from the air as his pilot lined up for his landing approach, making note of the steam vent on the middle of the runway indicating wind direction. In the tower, Vice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, clean-shaven head and face, watched the approach of Fuchida's plane through binoculars. He was already familiar with Fuchida, although they hadn't met, as 2 years earlier, Yamamoto had had the unpleasant task as Deputy Navy Minister of being responsible to apologize to the US ambassador for the bombing of USS Panay in China. He dropped the glasses to his chest, keeping his eyes on the aircraft, and leaned toward Captain Kusaka beside him. "Is that Fuchida, the squadron commander?" "Yes, sir." "Have him sent to my quarters." "Yes, sir, right away." After Kusaka gave brief instructions through a phone to the flight deck, they both watched intently as Fuchida's aircraft approached, adjusted its wings like a goose, hit the wooden deck with a hard thump into the arresting cables, and jerked to a violent halt. The pilot killed the engine as Fuchida pushed his canopy back to see an engineer in white waving both hands over his head to get his attention. Fuchida unbuckled his straps and looked down as the engineer pointed up to Yamamoto in the tower. Fuchida pulled his goggles up and nodded as he caught the gaze of Yamamoto. Fuchida smiled, then looked down and shook his head. Not him. Still, he was curious about the meeting. After changing into his navy blue uniform, Fuchida arrived and was seated at a glossy wooden table opposite Yamamoto in his quarters, richly detailed with inlaid wood panelling. Every piece of metal in sight was polished brass. Yamamoto's look was as straightforward as his mindset, no facial hair or glasses. His hair was close-cropped nearly to the skin. After the obligatory small talk, Yamamoto began to get to the point. "I expected your squadron to do well in the night bombing practice exercises last month, which I observed directly." While staring at Fuchida, Yamamoto took a slow puff from his cigarette. "But I didn't expect all 27 torpedoes to score hits, especially under tracer fire and with spotlights in your eyes." Perhaps, Fuchida thought, he'd been too quick to judge Yamamoto. Superior officers were usually all too eager to criticize flyers. He looked downward. "Sir, we were only doing our job. A failure of one flyer is a failure of all." "But you proved your point that a night attack on capital ships can be very successful." Fuchida looked up. "Tell me, what do you think of Hitler's blitzkrieg?" He tried to restrain his delight as he was mesmerized by the news streaming from Germany and their unstoppable forces. "Admiral, I think this was a brilliant move." Though usually relaxed, even Fuchida felt tense in the presence of Yamamoto and made a conscious effort not to glance at the Admiral's left hand, missing 2 fingers from his participation in the Battle of Tsushima, Japan's greatest naval victory to date. Conquering a nation in 6 weeks? This required careful planning and perfect execution. They carried it out flawlessly. The Germans can't be stopped. The way to attack is swiftly and decisively. "How's your work coming along here on the Akagi? Please speak freely. I want the truth." Yamamoto's eyes would accept nothing less. He tapped his cigarette in the ashtray. Fuchida wasn't sure what would happen if he said what he really believed, but knew he'd never have a better chance than this one. "Admiral," Fuchida repositioned himself, "the one question I'm repeatedly asked that tests my patience is, how many planes do we need to protect our battleships? This is upside down." Fuchida leaned forward. "Carriers shouldn't be looked at as defensive forces, but as attack forces. What I believe we should do is to gather all of our carriers with our aircraft into one great air squadron with massive striking power and have the battleships, cruisers and destroyers protect the carriers. Instead of separate commanders over each ship, all the ship's squadrons should be put under a single command. I believe this would be far more effective." Fuchida leaned back. "But if I ever spoke my mind freely around the old commanders, well, they'd hang me, so I just shut up." Yamamoto nodded. "No, I agree. I've been thinking along the same lines for some time now. I'm convinced that we've underestimated the tactical strength of air power." Fuchida was relieved, but even more, he was surprised. He was beginning to like this new commander. "Soon we'll move in this direction." Yamamoto rose, as did Fuchida, and extended his hand. "We'll speak again." 1940. Spring. Tacoma, Washington. Jake stood in greasy coveralls on a small platform below the wing of a B-17 Flying Fortress, holding a wrench for a mechanic under the open cowling of one of its 4 engines. The hangar smelled of oil-soaked rags and rang with the click and ping of engineers working on the 3 other brand-new Boeing B-17s recently delivered to the McCord Field Base. It wasn't what Jake had planned on, but with Europe at war, he was an attractive candidate to the U.S. Army Air Corps who were looking for men, and a steady-paying job made the Army Air Corps equally attractive to him. To Jake, grease under his fingernails was better than turkey down in his hair. Chewing a wad of gum, the 30-ish mechanic with the bill of his cap flipped up, rattled on. "So I wondered to myself, why the heck am I fixing broken-down cars for nothing, when I can work for Uncle Sam with better pay, all the benefits, and none of the belly-aching customers? Get me?" "Me and business don't seem to get along too well either," Jake said. "I joined up to be a pilot, but they said I was too old." Jake didn't mind the mechanical work, or even working for someone else, but was pretty disappointed about not being able to fly. "Hand me a half-inch wrench, will ya?" The gum chewer twisted away without looking back. Jake pulled out a jangling drawer of wrenches and found what he was looking for. "What do you think the Japs are up to? The papers say things are getting hot." He handed off the wrench. The mechanic ducked out from under the open cowling, shook his head, then pulled a rag from his back pocket and wiped the black grease from his hands. "Don't you know? The Japs are a big joke. They can't fly because they can't see. Here, take your fingers and do this." He put 2 fingers at each temple and stretched his face, pulling his eyes into slits. Jake did the same, making the pair look like a couple of school kids playing games. "How's it look? All blurry, huh?" He let go of his face, leaving finger grease prints on his temples. Yeah, you're right." Jake stood with his eyes pulled and gazed around the hangar. It really was all blurry. "See? That's why they all wear glasses." He grabbed a black hose and pushed it onto a fitting. "And they don't have no balance either. All them Jap mums put their babies on their backs and they rock all around. They can't fly worth beans. If they ever get the idea to mess with the USA..." He looked down at Jake. "They'll be DOA. Get me?" He turned back, gave a weird chuckle to himself, and kept chewing his gum. Jake nodded with a smile as if he'd been handed a pearl of wisdom. June 1940. Central Philippine University on the island of Panay, Iloilo, the Philippines. Peggy hauled her tan leather suitcase down the stairs to the front door of their concrete, tin-roofed staff quarters. It was a rather utilitarian place, but she felt it sufficed after they had driven out the rats and bats when they arrived 2 years earlier. It was a mess after having no occupants for a year, but they made it into a home. The greater campus consisted of white buildings with red tile roofs surrounded by coconut palms reaching up to the sky. "Here, Peg." Chalmer held out a magazine featuring a photo of Peggy at age 11 with her sister Alice, 8 at the time, both in kimonos holding Japanese dolls. The article headline read, "Foreign Girls Love Japan." "Why don't you take this with you?" "Oh, Mom, thanks." Peggy had forgotten about the magazine photo, and it made her miss the only home she'd ever known, Japan. Peggy was happy that her dad had accepted the offer to teach English and Bible at the Central Philippine University, so they relocated to the island of Panay, a triangle-shaped tropical island in the middle of the over 7,000 islands of the Philippines. The island, covered with lush vegetation, palm trees, and wild orchids, measured about 100 miles wide by 120 miles long. Her mum found a job teaching at a nearby high school, so she thought that was pretty great too. "I don't have much for the cold weather of New York," Peggy said to Charmer, "so I'll have to get some winter clothes when I'm at college." "Less to take with you on the ship and the trains. A 10,000-mile trip for a young lady like you. It'll be quite a journey." She ran her fingers through Peggy's hair. Peggy smiled. Even though she was not quite 17, she felt more like a woman, but to her mum she knew she'd always be just a girl. "Let me see your ticket," Jimmy said, as he picked up her suitcase and impatiently motioned with his fingers. "Dad, I've got it." Peggy reached in her shoulder bag, pulled it out, and waved it in front of him sarcastically. She hated being talked to like a kid, but crossing the Pacific Ocean and the continental United States by herself would be a challenge, a trip halfway around the world, but she was up for it. She liked challenges. Her application had been accepted at Keuka College for Women in upstate New York, and she looked forward to school, but now surrounded by her mom, dad, sister, and brother, she felt a physical sadness knowing she would miss them soon. Jimmy ushered her toward the open doorway. "Kiss your brother and sister. We can't be late. Got to get to Manila early enough to make sure everything's set." He wiped the perspiration off his forehead onto his sleeve. "Don't want the steamer leaving without you. Then we'd be stuck with you." Peggy hugged her brother, David. "Well, it'll be a while before we're all back together again." She gave her younger sister Alice a hug like a best friend. "I guess I'll see both of you sometime when you come to school in the States in not too long, okay?" On board the ship, standing at the rail, Charmer, Jimmy, and Peggy watched a crane hauling a cargo net of mailbags as it swung into the hold of their small steamship, President Taft, in Manila Bay. Jimmy turned to Peggy, placed his hands on her shoulders, and looked her up and down as if to regret her coming of age. "Look to serve others. That's how you serve God." He reached his arms around her and held her more closely than he ever had in the past. Passengers with bags pressed past them. Charmer wiped her eyes. "Your brother and sister will be going to California soon for school out there. Please, please be careful, dear." "Don't you worry about me. I'm more worried about you and Dad with all this talk of war." Peggy couldn't wait for her journey to begin and felt safe leaving the Philippines, but couldn't help wondering what could happen in the islands. "I just don't understand it." As seagulls called overhead in the fading afternoon light, the loudspeaker system rudely blared out, "All aboard for San Francisco! Last call! All aboard for San Francisco!" Jimmy squeezed Peggy's shoulder and reassured her with his eyes. "Listen, General MacArthur's here with over 100,000 Filipino and American soldiers. We're safe until things settle down, and then we can all go back to Japan. Besides," he said with a gentle stroke of her face, "I don't believe the Japanese really want war anyway." October 8th, 1940. Tokyo Bay. Battleships, aircraft carriers, heavy cruisers, destroyers, and a host of other warships, 600,000 tons of them, blanketed the bay under a rumbling sky darkened with over 500 aircraft in the most muscular display of naval military power the world had ever seen. Tens of thousands of cheering spectators lined the shores in the parks of Yokohama and waved arms and flags from windows and trees, on rooftops, from buses, and on the beaches as far as the eye could see, erupting into deafening cheers and shouts of "Banzai! Banzai!" Sailors in white perfectly lined the entire length of the deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi. In the tower, Fushida and Captain Kusaka shielded their eyes from the sun as they gazed upward in pride at the display of air power droning above. On the deck of the battleship, Hiei were Admiral Yamamoto and the top military brass of the Imperial Japanese Navy, all in their impeccable navy blues replete with gold braids, colourful ribbons, and bright medals, facing Emperor Hirohito, seated on a raised platform, also in his military uniform. The Imperial Japanese government had declared 1940 as the 2600th anniversary of the founding of the nation by their first emperor, Jimmu, in 660 BC, and this was only one of many national celebrations held throughout the country during the year. In April, the Hakko-Ichiu monument, towering 120 feet, was dedicated in a solemn ceremony on the southern island of Kyushu in Miyazaki. Less than a month before the naval display, the Japanese ambassador Kurusu had signed the tripartite pact with Adolf Hitler of Germany and the Italian foreign minister Ciano, securing Japan's position as one of the three Axis powers. Japan held Formosa, Korea, and Manchukuo, along with other portions of China. Virtually all of Europe had fallen under German or Soviet control, and the marauding German Wolfpack submarines terrorized ships in the Atlantic, targeting military and civilian vessels alike. On the battleship Hiei, as an officer shouted, "Salute!" all snapped their right hands up, and a nearby battleship let loose her guns with an ear-splitting concussion that reverberated through the harbour with an echoing shockwave. The New World Order had begun. July 1941. Tacoma, Washington. Benny Goodman's wild, upbeat "Sing, Sing, Sing" blasted through tinny speakers in the smoky air of the off-base club, packed shoulder to shoulder with lusty servicemen and lovelorn gals. Jake slumped at the bar with a cheap date draped over his shoulder, his mind trying to think clearly through the fog of beer. "You don't want my turkeys?" I said. You don't want to buy my turkeys?" He flicked the ash off his cigarette and took a long puff. Tired of work and tired of his life, it was his time to blow off a little steam. "Ah, go on, Jake," his girl whined. "You said he bought your turkeys." Yeah, he bought them all, but I lost all my money." Jake raised his tall glass and polished off the last of it. "Well, for crying out loud, Jake, how could you lose all your money if he bought them all?" Jake slammed his glass on the counter and closed his eyes to concentrate. Had to nearly shout over the raucous music and laughter. "I had to borrow some money to buy extra feed, and I had to. The price dropped. 14 cents a pound, and but when?" "Bartender!" Jake's girl waved a hand in the air. "One more beer for this one. Then he goes to bed. This fella's a funny one." The bald bartender winked back. Jake turned to the girl and blinked slowly. "Lillian, Josephine. Don't let me ever buy baby turkeys again. No, not ever." August 1941, Kagoshima Air Base on the island of Kyushu, the southernmost main island of Japan. An Aichi D-3A dive bomber touched down on the runway in the morning sun and taxied past rows and rows of parked aircraft. Inside a brick building, Fuchida, in his regular khaki-green uniform before a classroom of young pilots, held out his hands, palms down, fingers together, and moved them like two planes. And by keeping a tight formation of only 3, instead of 5 or 7 aircraft, if the release is timed properly, at least one aircraft is sure to hit its mark every time. He dropped his arms. The blackboard behind him displayed various bombing trajectories on an XY axis. For larger targets, or from higher altitudes, we can assemble a formation of 9 aircraft grouped in 3s and, following the leader's signal, all release at the same time, and again, be assured of destroying our target. Tomorrow we'll do more target testing. That is all. The students picked up their papers and made their way toward the door where an officer stood smiling back at Fuchida. Clapping his hands deliberately, he slowly walked to the front. "Well done, teacher. Well done." Fuchida looked up as he closed his manuals. "Egusa, what gives me such an honor? Would the man Genda calls the #1 dive bomber in all Japan like to be a student in my class?" Egusa cocked his head. "Would you accept me?" "No, you'd make me look bad." Egusa took a seat on top of Fuchida's desk, took a long drag on his cigarette, and quickly eyed the door to make sure the students were clear. Fuchida sensed this was no ordinary call. "What's really going on down here?" Igusa said. No officer of your rank was ever kept a squadron commander. They keep moving you around to all these bases. Why? Fuchida reopened his folder to a rear pocket and plucked out a document on official letterhead and handed it to Igusa, who immediately began reading. Not just a squadron commander, Fuchida said, but flight commander of the 1st and 2nd Carrier Divisions, the entire air fleet.